There is a back room in Dublin, December 28, 1969. 16 men sit around a long wooden table, and they are about to split a movement in two. There is no flag on the wall, there is no microphone. There is a kettle in the corner, and the windows are taped over with newspaper because the Irish Special Branch has been watching the street for 3 days. By the end of that night, a name will be born: Provisional Irish Republican Army. The word provisional will turn out to be the longest joke in the history of European warfare. My name is Blackwell. I have spent 20 years walking through the rooms where wars actually start, not the rooms where treaties are signed, not the rooms where presidents speak. The small rooms, the cafes, the mountain villages, the cockpits, the barracks where one captain decided he would not obey one order and a country burned for 9 years afterward. Tonight, I want to take you through 6 of those rooms, 6 rebellions. 6 first shots. 6 men who said roughly the same sentence on 6 different days, in 6 different languages, in 6 different decades. Today, we begin. One of them ended 60 days later in a falling Embraer over the Tver region of Russia. We will get there. We will get there last. I want you to understand something before we walk into that Dublin back room. Civil wars do not begin with manifestos. They do not begin with podcasts or party congresses or 30-page declarations posted on a wall. Those things happen later, when the war already has a name and a flag and a payroll. Civil wars begin with one day. They begin with one shot. They begin with one man who walks across a line at 4 in the afternoon and discovers that the line cannot be walked back. Watch the dates. Don't watch the slogans. The slogans lie. The dates do not. The Irish Republican Army of 1969 was a tired organization. It had spent the late 50s and early 60s on what historians politely call the Border Campaign, and what most of the Catholic neighborhoods of Belfast called nothing at all, because the Border Campaign had failed, and the IRA leadership in Dublin had quietly decided to put down the gun and pick up Marxist theory. They were going to become a political movement. They were going to talk. They were going to be respectable. And while the Dublin headquarters was reading Karl Marx in 1968, the streets of Belfast were filling with petrol bombs. There was a man named Sean McStephon. He was not Irish-born. He was English. His real name was John Stevenson, and he had grown up in Leytonstone in East London, the son of an Englishman and an Irish mother. He had taught himself Irish in a British prison cell after being arrested in 1953 for stealing weapons from a Royal Air Force armory at Felsted. By the time he came out of that cell, he had become more Irish than the Irish. He spoke the language. He used the Gaelic form of his name. He believed in physical force republicanism with the cold conviction of a convert, and he watched the Dublin leadership turn into a debating society with a slow and rising fury. In August 1969, the streets of Belfast went up. Catholic families on Bombay Street and Conway Street watched their houses burn while loyalist mobs walked through the neighborhoods unopposed. People came to the IRA, the supposed defenders of the Catholic population, and asked for guns. There were almost no guns. There was a story afterward, possibly apocryphal, possibly true, that someone painted the letters IRA on a wall in West Belfast, and then someone else came along underneath and added a single word: I ran away. That graffito did more political damage than any English propaganda ever did. It told the Catholic community that the organization that claimed to protect them was not there. December 28, 1969. The Army Convention met in Dublin. Max Stephon walked in with a faction. He demanded that the leadership reverse its decision to recognize the parliaments in Dublin, Belfast, and London. He demanded that the organization rearm. He demanded that the organization fight. The vote went against him. He stood up mint. The first real shot of that new organization was not fired in 1969. It was fired in July 1970 on the Falls Road in West Belfast. The British Army, which had originally been welcomed into the Catholic neighborhoods that previous summer as a protection force against loyalist mobs, conducted a weapons search in the Lower Falls area on the 3rd of July, 1970. They sealed off the streets. They imposed a curfew. For 36 hours, 3,000 soldiers moved through Catholic homes, kicking in doors, searching mattresses, breaking furniture. By the time they left, 4 civilians were dead, 60 were wounded, and 1,700 canisters of CS gas had been fired into a square half a mile across. The Falls curfew did not invent the Troubles. The Troubles were already underway. But the Falls curfew did something far more dangerous. It convinced an entire generation of young Catholic men that the British Army was an occupying force, and that the Provisional IRA was the only organization that would shoot back. Recruitment after the Falls curfew was an avalanche. Max Jaffna became Chief of Staff of the Provisional IRA in October 1970. He was 42 years old. He would last in the role until November 1972, when he was arrested in Dublin and went on a hunger strike that ended quietly when his health began to collapse. He died in 2001 in his bed in County Meath. The organization he had founded by walking out of a back room continued for another 6 years after his death, until the disarmament of 2005. Provisional. The word means temporary. The word means until something else replaces it. The Provisional IRA lasted 36 years. It killed approximately 1,700 people. It survived 11 British prime ministers. It outlasted the Soviet Union. The men who walked out of that Dublin back room on December 28, 1969, thought they were starting a short campaign to finish the unfinished work of the 1921 treaty. What they actually started was the longest insurgency in modern European history. The lesson of that back room is not about Ireland. The lesson is about words. The provisional often turns out to be the permanent. The temporary often turns out to be the only thing that lasts. Now I want you to come with me to a different country and a different mountain. May 27, 1964. The southern department of Tolima in the Colombian Andes. There is a village called Marquetalia. It is so small that it does not appear on most government maps. It is reached by a single mule track that climbs out of the valley of the Rio Ata. There are 48 peasant families living there, working corn and coffee and a little cattle. They have been there since the early 1950s. When the period of Colombian history, known simply as La Violencia, drove tens of thousands of liberal-affiliated peasants out of the lowlands and up into the mountains. La Violencia killed perhaps 200,000 Colombians between 1948 and 1958. By the time it ended, there were several so-called independent peasant republics scattered through the Cordillera, and Marquetalia was one of them. The man who led Marquetalia was named Pedro Antonio Marin. He was 33 years old in 1964. He had grown up in the coffee country of Quindío, the eldest son of liberal peasant parents, and he had watched his family driven off their land in 1948 by conservative paramilitaries. He had picked up a rifle at the age of 17, and he had not put it down. By the early 1960s, he had taken the nom de guerre Manuel Marulanda Vélez, after a labor leader killed by police. The peasants in the mountains called him by another name, Tiro Fijo. It means sure shot. He earned the name in 100 small skirmishes, and he kept it for the next 50 years. In 1963, the Colombian government, under President Guillermo León Valencia, decided that the independent peasant republics were a communist threat. The decision was not entirely wrong. There were communist organizers in the mountains. There was a small Communist Party presence in Marquetalia. There was also, more importantly, a great deal of pressure from Washington. The Kennedy administration had launched the Alliance for Progress in 1961, and one of the things the Alliance for Progress required of Latin American partners was a credible counterinsurgency capacity. Colombia complied. The plan was called Plan Lazo. It was developed by Colombian army officers trained at the School of the Americas. and it had a specific target. Marquetalia first, the other peasant republics afterward. On May 27, 1964, 16,000 Colombian soldiers began their advance on the village. The peasants of Marquetalia numbered approximately 1,000, of whom only 48 were armed combatants. The math was not subtle. It was 333 soldiers for every armed peasant. The official aim was to capture or eliminate the leadership of the so-called Republic, which the government had identified as a small group around Marulanda. The unofficial aim, the one that emerged from the cables and the after-action reports, was to demonstrate to the rural Colombian peasantry and to Washington that the Colombian state could project force into any corner of the Cordillera. The operation was, on its own terms, a complete success. The army occupied Marquetalia within 10 days. The village was emptied, the houses were searched, and many were burned. The crops were trampled, the mules were shot. The army took photographs of itself standing in the abandoned plaza of the so-called Republic of Marquetalia, and the photographs ran in the Bogota newspapers for a week. The defense minister flew over the area in a helicopter and declared the operation complete. There was, however, one small problem. The 48 armed peasants were not in the village. They had walked out 3 days before the army arrived, into the high jungle to the east, carrying everything they could carry on their backs and on the backs of the mules that had not yet been shot. On July 20th, 1964, in a clearing in the high jungle, those 48 men held a meeting. They drafted a document called the Agrarian Program of the Guerrillas. They declared that the war against the Colombian state would now be expanded from a defensive war for the peasant republics into an offensive war for agrarian reform across the country. They announced the formation of a new organization. They called it the Southern Bloc. 2 years later, at a second conference in 1966, they renamed it Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC. Manuel Marulanda Vélez was named Commander-in-Chief. He held that position without interruption for 44 years. Operation Marquetalia is the founding myth of FARC. Like most founding myths, it has the advantage of being true. 48 peasants attacked by 16,000 soldiers walked out of a village and started a war that would last for 52 years and kill more than 220,000 Colombians. They did not start that war on the day they walked out. They started it on the day the army decided that 48 farmers were a strategic threat. The Colombian state, with American funding and American advisors, manufactured its own most enduring enemy. By the time the peace accord was signed in Havana in November 2016, the FARC had between 7,000 and 10,000 fighters under arms. Tirofico himself was not there to see it. He died in March 2008 of a heart attack in a guerrilla camp in the Colombian jungle. 50 years of war, 44 of them under his command. Never captured, never wounded in any battle that we can verify. The army that had attacked his village in 1964 spent the rest of his life trying to find him, and never did. The lesson of Marquetalia is not about Colombia. The lesson is about overreaction. A small problem treated as a small problem stays small. A small problem treated as an existential threat becomes one. The Colombian army did not invent FARC, but it gave FARC a story. Founding myths are made of moments like that. A village, 48 men, 16,000 soldiers. The math was wrong from the beginning. The math is always wrong from the beginning. Now I want to take you to an island, to a road, to a patrol jeep, to 13 soldiers who did not see the morning of July 24th. Sri Lanka in 1983 was a country with a problem it had refused to solve for 35 years. The Sinhala majority, roughly 74% of the population, ran the government, the army, and the universities. The Tamil minority, roughly 18% of the population, concentrated in the north and east of the island, had been steadily squeezed out of state employment, university quotas, and political representation since independence in 1948. There had been riots in 1958. There had been more riots in 1977. There had been a low-grade Tamil militancy operating in the Jaffna Peninsula since the early 1970s, with several small armed groups competing for recruits among the unemployed Tamil young men of the north. The most disciplined of those small groups was led by a young man named Velupillai Prabhakaran. He had been born in November 1954 in the coastal town of Valvetiturai on the north coast of the Jaffna Peninsula. His father was a minor government clerk. He left school at 17, joined a Tamil youth movement, and by the age of 18, he was already involved in the assassination of the mayor of Jaffna, Alfred Duraiappah, in July 1975. He was 20 years old. By 1976, he had founded an organization he called the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE. The word Eelam meant the Tamil homeland. The word Liberation Tigers meant exactly what it said. For 7 years, the LTTE was one of perhaps half a dozen Tamil militant groups, most of them small, most of them poorly armed, all of them engaged in occasional ambushes of police stations and Sri Lankan soldiers in the north. The Sri Lankan government did not take them seriously. The Sri Lankan army garrison in Jaffna was small, complacent, and badly trained. The road network in the peninsula was poor. The intelligence picture was almost non-existent. Sinhalese officers serving in Jaffna often spoke no Tamil. They moved in convoys. They patrolled at night because they were afraid to patrol during the day. And they patrolled in routes so predictable that any local schoolboy could draw the schedule from memory. On the night of July 23, 1983, a Sri Lankan army patrol designated 44 Bravo was moving along a back road in the Thirunelveli area on the northern outskirts of the Jaffna town. The patrol consisted of an officer, a non-commissioned officer, and roughly a dozen soldiers. They were riding in a soft-skinned vehicle. Prabhakaran had personally selected the ambush site weeks earlier. The LTTE detonated an improvised explosive device under the vehicle. The men who survived the blast were engaged with small arms from the surrounding tree line. By the time the firing stopped, 13 Sri Lankan soldiers were dead. It was the deadliest single attack on the Sri Lankan army by Tamil militants in the history of the conflict up to that point. What happened next is what makes that ambush a turning point rather than just another incident. The bodies of the 13 soldiers were flown to Colombo. The government, against the advice of several senior officers, decided to hold a public funeral at Canate Cemetery in the capital on July 24th. A crowd gathered. The crowd grew. By late afternoon, the crowd had become a mob, and the mob had voter rolls in its hands. Voter rolls. Mimeographed lists distributed by men whose identities have been argued about for 40 years, listing the addresses of Tamil families in Colombo and the surrounding districts. The mob moved through the city for the next 4 days. Between the 24th and the 30th of July, 1983, anywhere from 400 to 3,000 Tamils were killed in Colombo and other Sinhalese majority cities. Tamil shops were burned. Tamil houses were burned. Tamil businesses were destroyed at a scale that was almost industrial. The police, in many cases, watched. The army, in many cases, did not arrive. The week became known as Black July. The political consequence of Black July was not simply outrage in the Tamil North. It was a transformation of the Tamil militant movement. Before Black July, the LTTE was one of half a dozen small armed groups, with at most a few hundred fighters. After Black July, tens of thousands of young Tamil men crossed the Palk Strait to India to seek training, and the LTTE, because of Prabhakaran's discipline and his willingness to absorb or eliminate rival groups, became the dominant force among them. By 1986, The LTTE had absorbed or destroyed every other significant Tamil militant organization. By the early 1990s, it controlled most of the Jaffna Peninsula. It built an army. It built a navy, which it called the Sea Tigers. It even, briefly, built an air wing, with light aircraft flown out of jungle airstrips. It pioneered the suicide vest in modern asymmetric warfare. Its Black Tiger unit conducted more than 300 such attacks before the war ended. The war ended in May 2009 on the banks of the Nandikada Lagoon on the northeastern coast of Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan army, finally well-trained, finally well-equipped, finally led by officers who had spent 25 years learning the lessons of the early war, had pushed the remnants of the LTTE into a narrow strip of beach. Prabhakaran was killed there on the 18th of May 2009. He was 54 years old. He had spent 33 years in the field. The body was photographed, and the photographs were distributed within hours. 13 soldiers died on a back road on July 23, 1983. That ambush did not start the Sri Lankan Civil War by itself. The Civil War was already coming. But the ambush triggered the response that defined the war. Black July was not a riot. It was a pogrom, organized with voter rolls. And the pogrom convinced the Tamil population that there was no future inside the Sri Lankan state. 26 years of war followed. The lesson is not about Sri Lanka. The lesson is that ethnic violence is almost never spontaneous. There is always a list. There is always a man with a list. And there is always a state that decided not to look at the man with the list until it was too late. Now I want to take you to a city of mosques and gardens in western Afghanistan in the spring of 1979. Herat is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. It has been there since at least 500 years before Christ. Alexander the Great captured it. The Mongols destroyed it. The Timurids rebuilt it into one of the great cities of the Islamic world. By the late 1970s, it was a city of perhaps 150,000 people, set on the high desert plain of western Afghanistan, 60 miles from the Iranian border, surrounded by orchards and irrigated wheat fields and the blue-tiled minarets of the Friday Mosque. The Soviet consulate in Herat at the beginning of 1979 had a staff of approximately 50, including military advisors. Their job was to assist the new Afghan government, which had taken power in a coup in April 1978 and which called itself the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or in the Russian abbreviation, the PDPA. The PDPA government was a narrow, urban Marxist clique that had inherited a country that was overwhelmingly rural, religious, and tribal. From the moment it took power, it began issuing decrees that, on paper, looked like a textbook modernization program, and on the ground looked like a frontal assault on every social institution that ordinary Afghans cared about. Land reform that ignored the existing structure of village agreements. Forced literacy classes that put unmarried women in classrooms with unrelated men in violation of every village convention. The replacement of the green Islamic flag with a red socialist banner. The arrest, in the autumn and winter of 1978, of perhaps 12,000 religious figures, tribal leaders, and former government officials, many of whom were never seen again. By March 1979, the country was already in a slow-burning rebellion in dozens of districts, but it had not yet exploded. It exploded in Herat. The 17th Infantry Division of the Afghan Army was garrisoned in Herat. Among its officers was a captain named Mohammed Ismail. He was a Tajik, born in 1946 in the village of Nasirabad in the Shindan district south of the city. He had graduated from the Kabul Military Academy. He spoke Persian, Pashto, and a little Russian. He had served loyally under the previous monarchy and under the republic that overthrew the monarchy in 1973. When the PDPA took power in April 1978, he had stayed at his post, like most Afghan officers, and waited to see what would happen. By March 1979, what was happening was that he was being asked to deploy his soldiers to suppress a religious uprising in the villages around Herat and he had decided that he would not. On the morning of March 15, 1979, the city of Herat rose. The exact spark is debated. Some accounts say it began with a sermon in the Friday mosque. Some accounts say it began with women throwing stones at a PDPA literacy class. Some accounts say it began with a deserter from the 17th Division shooting a Soviet advisor in the bazaar. What is not debated is what happened over the next several hours. Mobs filled the streets. PDPA officials were attacked. The houses of party members were burned. And then the 17th Infantry Division, instead of suppressing the uprising, joined it. Captain Ismail, the man who would later be known to the world as Ismail Khan, had given the order. The garrison opened the armory. Rifles, machine guns, ammunition,
and grenades were distributed to the population.
The army of the Afghan state had become the army of the Afghan rebellion. For approximately a week, Herat was in the hands of the uprising. Soviet citizens in the city were hunted through the streets. Estimates of the number of Soviet personnel and their families killed during that week vary from a few dozen to over 100, with the higher figure including local Afghan staff. PDPA officials were killed in numbers that have never been precisely counted. The new government in Kabul, paralyzed and panicked, called Moscow on the morning of March 18th and asked for direct Soviet military intervention. The transcripts of those phone calls between the Afghan Prime Minister, Nur Mohammad Taraki, and the Soviet Premier, Alexei Kosygin, were declassified after the end of the Cold War. They are some of the most extraordinary documents of the late 20th century. Taraki begged for Soviet troops. Kosygin refused, repeatedly. For 9 months. He told Taraki that Soviet ground forces in Afghanistan would create a political catastrophe. He was correct. He was also overruled, eventually, by other voices in the Politburo. The Soviet response in March 1979 was not the invasion. The invasion came in December. The Soviet response in March was an air campaign. 2-16 bombers flew from bases in the Soviet Union, and MiG fighters flew from Shindand, and they flattened large parts of Herat. The estimates of the dead in that single week of bombing range from 5,000 to 24,000. The truth is probably closer to the higher figure than the lower one. Herat in late March 1979 was a city in ruins. The uprising was crushed by the Air Force, but the rebellion was not. The rebellion had now acquired what it had previously lacked: a name, Herat, a martyr count, and an army's worth of weapons in the hands of villagers who had no intention of giving them back. Ismail Khan escaped into the mountains of Ghor, with most of his battalion intact, and most of the 17th Division's armory on the backs of mules. Within a year, he was the most powerful Mujahideen commander in western Afghanistan. He held that position for the entire 10 years of the Soviet occupation. He held it through the civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal. 9 became, in time, one of the longest-serving warlords in modern history. The Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan in December 1979 was not made because of Herat alone. There were other factors. The deteriorating health of the Soviet ambassador in Kabul, the factional bloodshed inside the PDPA itself, the fear that the Afghan government might pivot toward the United States. But the Herat uprising of March 1979 was the moment when the Politburo first seriously discussed direct intervention. It was the moment when the small problem became, in Moscow's eyes, a strategic problem. The invasion that followed in December lasted 9 years and 1 month. It killed approximately 15,000 Soviet soldiers and somewhere between 1 and 2 million Afghans. It contributed materially to the bankruptcy and collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet Union, as a state, did not survive the invasion of Afghanistan by a full decade. The lesson of Herat is not about Afghanistan. The lesson is about how foreign interventions actually start. They do not start with grand strategic decisions in marble palaces. They start with one captain in one provincial city who decides on one specific morning that he will not obey one specific order. Captain Ismail Khan did not intend to drag the Soviet Union into a 9-year war. He intended only to refuse to fire on his own people. The consequences of that refusal traveled, by the careful accounting of history, all the way to the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in 1991. Watch the captains. The generals are predictable. It is the captains who change the world. Now I want to take you across an ocean and forward 15 years to a different mountain range, to a different oppressed peasantry, to a different night. January 1st, 1994. Midnight. Chiapas, the southernmost state of Mexico. The night is cold in the highlands. The air is thin. There is fog moving through the streets of San Cristobal de las Casas, a colonial city of 200,000 people, with stone churches and red-tiled roofs and a central plaza laid out by the Spanish 450 years ago. At exactly midnight, 3,000 men and women, almost all of them indigenous Maya, almost all of them wearing black ski masks or red bandanas across their faces, walked into 7 towns of the Chiapas highlands simultaneously: San Cristobal, Las Margaritas, Altamirano, Ocosingo, Chanal, Oxchuc, Huixtan. They occupied the municipal palaces. They unfurled banners reading EZLN. Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. They had been preparing for this night for 10 years. The man who stepped to the microphone in San Cristobal de las Casas at dawn on January 1st, 1994, called himself Subcomandante Marcos. He wore a black ski mask. He smoked a pipe. He spoke in fluent Spanish with a clear urban accent that did not match the indigenous fighters around him. His real name, although it was not confirmed for years afterward, was Rafael Sebastián Guillén Vicente. He had been born in 1957 in Tampico on the Gulf of Mexico. His father owned a furniture store. He had studied philosophy at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, where he had written a thesis on the French philosopher Louis Althusser. He had taught for several years at the Autonomous Metropolitan University in Mexico City. In 1984, he had walked into the Lacandon jungle of Chiapas with a small group of urban Marxists, expecting to teach revolutionary theory to indigenous peasants. The peasants, by his own later admission, had taught him a great deal more than he had taught them. The choice of January 1st, 1994 was not arbitrary. At the stroke of midnight on that date, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, came into force, binding the economies of Mexico, the United States, and Canada into a single trading bloc. NAFTA had been negotiated under President Carlos Salinas de Gortari and ratified by the Mexican Senate in 1993. It was the centerpiece of the Salinas administration's economic program. It was supposed to be Mexico's entry into the modern world. The Zapatista uprising at the precise minute of NAFTA's entry into force was a deliberate act of historical timing. The uprising was, among other things, an argument that the indigenous peasantry of southern Mexico, which had not benefited from 20th century Mexican modernization, would not benefit from a North American free trade zone either, and would in fact be further dispossessed. The military aspect of the uprising lasted 12 days. The Mexican army responded within 48 hours. There were sharp engagements at Ocosingo and Altamirano, where the Zapatistas, lightly armed and outnumbered, took significant casualties. By January 12th, after international and domestic pressure on President Salinas, a unilateral ceasefire was declared. The total death toll of the active military phase has been variously estimated, with figures ranging from 150 to over 400. After January 12th, the Zapatista uprising ceased to be primarily a military operation and became something the world had not seen before. It became a media operation conducted in cyberspace. Subcomandante Marcos understood, in a way that almost no other guerrilla leader in history had understood, that the audience for an insurgency in the 1990s was no longer the local peasantry or even the national bourgeoisie. The audience was the global press and the new and rapidly expanding network called the Internet. He wrote communiques that were not military bulletins but literary essays. He quoted Cervantes and Garcia Marquez. He referred to himself in the third person. He created a fictional companion, an old indigenous elder named Antonio, whose stories framed many of the communiques. The communiques were faxed to Mexican newspapers and uploaded to early internet bulletin boards by sympathizers in Mexico City and California,
where they were translated into English and French and German within hours. The Zapatistas became, retrospectively, the first insurgency of the digital age. By the spring of 1994, journalists were arriving in San Cristobal from 20 countries. By 1996, when the first international encounter for humanity and against neoliberalism was held in the Lacandon jungle, 3,000 intellectuals, activists, and students from over 40 countries traveled to Chiapas to hear Marcos speak from behind his ski mask. The military balance on the ground in Chiapas was never favorable to the Zapatistas. The Mexican army surrounded the Zapatista zone of control with tens of thousands of troops. There were repeated paramilitary attacks, including the massacre at Acteal in December 1997, in which 45 indigenous people, mostly women and children associated with a Zapatista sympathetic community, were killed by a paramilitary group while praying in a small chapel. The military pressure was constant. But the Zapatistas survived, and they survived precisely because their security did not come from their military strength. It came from their global visibility. To eliminate them militarily would have been a political catastrophe for any Mexican government, and the Zapatistas knew it. And the Mexican government, eventually, knew it too. In May 2014, Subcomandante Marcos appeared at a Zapatista assembly and announced that the figure of Marcos was being retired. He said that the persona had been a hologram, a media construct, useful at a particular historical moment, and now no longer necessary. He took a new name, Subcomandante Galeano, in honor of a Zapatista teacher recently killed in a paramilitary attack. The man behind the mask was now in his late 50s. The communities of Chiapas had built dozens of autonomous schools and clinics. The original demands had not been met by the Mexican state, but the autonomous structures had survived for 2 decades, which by the standards of insurgency is an extraordinary achievement. The Zapatistas timed their war to a trade agreement, and by doing so, they made the trade agreement, in many parts of the world, an afterthought. NAFTA went into force on January 1, 1994, and almost no one outside professional economic circles remembers the date. 3,000 masked men and women walked into 7 towns at midnight on the same date. And an entire generation of activists across Latin America and Europe and North America remembers it precisely. That is not an accident. That is the function of timing. The lesson of the Zapatistas is not about Marxism or indigenous rights or trade policy. The lesson is that the hour at which you announce yourself decides whether the world hears you. 3,000 fighters cannot defeat a national army. But 3,000 fighters who appear in front of the world's cameras at the precise minute of a global political event can rewrite, for a long time afterward, what that event is understood to mean. Now I want to take you to the last room, the largest room, the room where I, Blackwell, was actually present. A cafe on Pushkinskaya Street in Rostov-on-Don, Russia. June 23, 2023, late afternoon. The summer light is heavy and yellow, the way it gets in southern Russia in late June. I am sitting at a small round table near the window, with a glass of black tea and a notebook in front of me. The waitress is a woman of about 50, with tired eyes and a name tag I can no longer remember. She refills my tea twice without my asking. There is a column of armored vehicles passing the window. They are moving north on the boulevard outside, in the direction of the M4 highway, which runs straight to Moscow. The vehicles are painted dark green, but the white W and the white V and other markings of the Russian invasion of Ukraine have been crudely covered with strips of black tape. On several of the trucks, there is a different symbol, painted in white,
A skull. The skull of the Wagner Group. The waitress sets the glass down. She looks out the window. She does not speak. The man at the next table, a heavy man in his 60s in a worn-out shirt, does not speak. The two young women at the table behind me do not speak. Nobody in the cafe is speaking.
Outside, on the boulevard, ordinary citizens of Rostov-on-Don are doing what ordinary citizens of Rostov-on-Don have been doing all afternoon. Some of them are taking selfies with the soldiers. Some of them are bringing them sandwiches and bottles of water. Some of them are standing on the curb, arms crossed, watching the column pass with an expression I have only seen a few times in my life. It is the expression of a population that has decided, collectively and without coordination, to wait and see who wins, and to be polite to whoever is in front of them in the meantime. The man whose column it was had been born 62 years earlier in Leningrad, Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin. His mother was a nurse, his stepfather was a sports trainer. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, and at the age of 18, he was arrested for theft. He went to prison briefly. He came out, was arrested again at 20 for a more serious set of charges, and went back to prison for 9 years, from 1981 to 1990. By the time he was released, the Soviet Union itself had only a year left to live. He came home to a city about to rename itself St. Petersburg, in a country about to rename itself the Russian Federation. Prigozhin's first business after prison was a hot dog stand in the Apraksin Dvor market in central St. Petersburg. He told an interviewer years later that within a few months, his mother was helping him count rubles in stacks. He moved up. He opened a small grocery chain. He partnered with other men in the food business. By the late 1990s, he had opened a floating restaurant on the Neva River called New Island, which became one of the most fashionable establishments in the city. The deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in those years, a former intelligence officer named Vladimir Putin, was a regular customer. When Putin became president of Russia in 2000, the floating restaurant on the Neva became a place where heads of state were entertained. Jacques Chirac dined there. George W. Bush dined there. Prigozhin personally served the soup. He acquired the nickname Putin's Chef. The nickname was accurate but incomplete. Prigozhin was not just a caterer. He was a man who had understood, very early, the precise mechanics of the relationship between a Russian businessman and the Russian state. By the late 2000s, Prigozhin's holding company, Concord, was receiving billions of rubles in state contracts. Catering for the Russian army, catering for Moscow public schools, catering for the Kremlin itself. In 2013, journalists working for the independent Russian outlet Novaya Gazeta and the St. Petersburg-based publication Fontanka began to expose another set of Prigozhin enterprises. A so-called troll factory in a St. Petersburg office building, formally registered as the Internet Research Agency, employing several hundred people whose job was to flood Russian and foreign social media with carefully designed political content. By 2017, the Internet Research Agency was being indicted in the United States as part of the Mueller investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 American election. Prigozhin was named personally in the indictment. He laughed about it publicly. He had reasons to laugh. The indictment was not enforceable in Russia, and inside Russia, his fortunes were continuing to rise. The Wagner Group was first identified by name in 2014. In the spring of that year, after the Russian annexation of Crimea, a small force of Russian-speaking fighters, organized in a private military company structure that did not legally exist under Russian law, appeared in eastern Ukraine to support the separatist republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. The unit was commanded by a former Russian Special Forces lieutenant colonel named Dmitry Utkin. Utkin's personal call sign was Wagner, after the German composer. Utkin reportedly had a number of tattoos on his upper body that referenced the symbology of the Third Reich. The unit took his call sign as its name. Within a year, the Wagner Group had been deployed to Syria, where it operated in support of the government of Bashar al-Assad and against the various rebel factions there. Within 5 years, it had operated in Libya, in Sudan, in the Central African Republic, in Mali, in Mozambique, and in Madagascar.
Its business model was a combination of direct payment from the Russian Ministry of Defense, payment from foreign client governments in cash or mining concessions, and side enterprises, particularly in gold and diamond extraction, that provided independent revenue. By 2022, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, Wagner had grown from a few hundred contractors to an organization that could field, at peak, 50,000 men. Prigozhin's relationship with the Russian Ministry of Defense in 2022 and 2023 deteriorated steadily. The reasons were multiple. He was openly contemptuous of the regular Russian military leadership, particularly the Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. He recorded video messages from frontline positions in eastern Ukraine in which he accused the ministry of withholding ammunition from Wagner units. He claimed publicly that Wagner had taken the city of Bakhmut in May 2023 at a cost of 20,000 of his own men, while regular Russian forces had failed to advance in adjacent sectors. By June 2023, the Russian Ministry of Defense had announced that all so-called volunteer formations operating in Ukraine, including Wagner, would be required to sign formal contracts directly with the ministry by July 1st. Prigozhin understood, correctly, that this was an attempt to dissolve Wagner as an independent organization and to absorb its men into the regular military command structure. He understood that without Wagner, he had no leverage and no protection. He decided in the second half of June 2023 to act. The action began on the night of June 22nd to 23rd. Prigozhin recorded a video message that was released to his Telegram channel. In it, he accused the Ministry of Defense of having struck a Wagner field camp inside Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. He announced what he called a March of Justice. He said that Wagner forces would advance into Russia to demand the resignation of Shoigu and Gerasimov. He insisted, then and afterward, that the operation was not a coup against President Putin. The distinction was legally and politically meaningful, and it was also politically dubious. And the men of Wagner moved before anyone in Moscow could fully decide which interpretation was correct. A Wagner column crossed the border from occupied Ukraine into the Rostov region of southern Russia in the early hours of June 23rd. The men entered Rostov-on-Don, a city of more than 1 million people and the headquarters of the Russian Southern Military District, with almost no resistance. They occupied the Southern Military District headquarters building on Budyonovsky Avenue. Prigozhin himself arrived in Rostov in the late morning. He was filmed inside the headquarters compound, speaking with the Deputy Defense Minister, Yunusbek Yevkurov, and the Deputy Chief of the Main Intelligence Directorate, General Vladimir Alexeyev. The conversation, captured on a phone camera by an unknown participant, was unguarded. Prigozhin was demanding the appearance of Shoigu and Gerasimov. The Russian generals were attempting to talk him down. They were not successful. By midday on June 23rd, Wagner units were advancing north along the M4 highway in 2 main columns. One column was moving from Rostov-on-Don. A second column was moving from positions in the Voronezh region. President Putin gave a televised address at 10 in the morning Moscow time on June 24th. He used the word treason. He compared the situation explicitly to the events of 1917, when the Russian state had collapsed during a war it was already losing. He did not name Prigozhin. He did not need to. The Russian state, which had spent the previous 15 months projecting an image of total internal stability while waging a major war abroad, was now openly admitting that an armed column was driving on the capital. That column reached the town of Yelets in Lipetsk region by late afternoon on June 24th. The southernmost units were within roughly 200 kilometers of Moscow. Russian Federal Security Service positions along the M4 had been bypassed or had withdrawn. There had been one significant engagement in which Wagner units had downed several Russian military helicopters and a military transport aircraft. The losses on the Russian aviation side were the heaviest single-day losses for the Russian air arm since the start of the Ukraine war. And then, in the late afternoon and early evening of June 24th, the column stopped. Prigozhin announced, again on Telegram, that he was turning his men around. He said that he wished to avoid Russian blood being spilled. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, was named publicly as the mediator. The terms of the agreement, as announced, were that Prigozhin would relocate to Belarus, criminal charges against him would be dropped, and Wagner fighters who wished to could either follow him to Belarus, sign contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, or return to civilian life. By midnight on June 24th, the columns were withdrawing. I left Rostov on the morning of June 25th. The waitress in the cafe on Pushkinskaya Street did not work the morning shift. A different waitress brought my tea. The boulevard outside was empty of armored vehicles. The skull-marked trucks were gone. The city was calm in the particular way that southern Russian cities are calm after something they do not intend to discuss. I paid in cash. I tipped well. I took a train to the airport. I left. For roughly 2 months after the March of Justice, Prigozhin moved between Russia and Belarus and at least one African country. He was photographed at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg in late July 2023. He recorded a video message from what appeared to be African terrain, possibly the Central African Republic or Mali, in mid-August. He did not, in any of those public appearances, look like a man in hiding. He looked, if anything, like a man who believed that the bargain struck on June 24th was a bargain that would be honored. On the afternoon of August 23, 2023, an Embraer Legacy 600 business jet, registration RA02795, took off from Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow at approximately 3 o'clock local time. It was scheduled to fly to Pulkovo Airport in St. Petersburg, a routine flight of approximately 1 hour and 10 minutes. The aircraft carried 10 people, 3 crew, 7 passengers. The passenger list, as published by the Russian Federal Air Transport Agency that evening, included Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin. It also included Dmitry Valerievich Utkin, the founder of Wagner, whose call sign had given the organization its name. It included Valery Chekalov, who oversaw Prigozhin's logistics operations. The other passengers were senior Wagner commanders or close associates. At approximately 18 minutes after takeoff, at an altitude of roughly 28,000 feet, the aircraft broke up in mid-flight over the village of Kuzenkino in the Tver region of Russia. The wreckage fell across an area of several square kilometers. There were no survivors. Russian state television announced the news within hours. The Federal Investigative Committee opened a formal investigation. By August 27th, Russian investigators had publicly named all 10 victims, including Prigozhin and Utkin. Genetic identification was confirmed by the same agency on August 30th. The investigation by the open-source research organization Bellingcat, conducted jointly with the Russian-language investigative outlet The Insider, was published in stages over the autumn of 2023. The investigation tracked the aircraft's movements in the days before the crash, examined satellite imagery of the crash site, and analyzed the public flight data available from the Russian air traffic system before that data became unavailable. The investigation concluded that the most likely cause of the crash was an explosive device or a surface-to-air missile. The Russian state did not formally adopt either conclusion. President Putin, asked about the crash several days later, expressed condolences and noted that Prigozhin had made what he called serious mistakes in his life. He did not deny responsibility. He did not need to. 60 days. From the column passing the cafe on Pushkinskaya Street to the wreckage in the field outside Kuzenkino. June 23rd to August 23rd. 2 months exactly, almost to the hour. Prigozhin had marched on Moscow, had stopped 200 kilometers short, had accepted a deal he had every reason to believe would not be honored, and had then lived for 60 days as if the deal might be honored after all. He had not gone into deep exile. He had not changed his name. He had not stopped flying on his own aircraft, on his own scheduled routes, with his own senior staff. The simplest explanation for that behavior is also the most disturbing. Prigozhin appears to have believed, on the basis of decades of close working relationship with Vladimir Putin, that he understood the rules of the game well enough to play it one more time. The evidence suggests he was wrong. The Wagner Group as an independent organization did not survive Prigozhin. Within weeks of the crash, the surviving senior commanders were either folded into the Russian Ministry of Defense, transferred to the new Africa Corps formation under direct ministry control, or quietly retired. The skull symbol disappeared from new vehicle markings. The Telegram channels that had been the organization's primary communications platform went silent or changed hands. The men who had been at the headquarters in Rostov on June 23rd found themselves, by the end of 2023, working for a state that no longer pretended that there was any distinction between a private military company and a regular military formation. The lesson of Wagner is not about Russia, although it is also about Russia. The lesson is about the speed of consequences in a particular kind of state. In a democracy, the consequences of an attempted coup unfold over years. There are commissions of inquiry, there are trials, there are appeals. The participants live, in most cases, to write memoirs and to argue with historians about what really happened. In the kind of system that Russia has become, the consequences unfold over weeks, and the participants do not live to write the memoirs. Prigozhin was a sophisticated operator who had survived for 23 years inside that system, and he had become so convinced of his own ability to read the system that he flew on his own aircraft, on his own routes, with his own senior staff 60 days after marching on the capital. He turned around to live. He lived 60 days. 6 rebellions, 6 first shots, 6 men who said, on 6 different days, in 6 different languages, in 6 different decades, the same essential sentence. Today, we begin. Sean McStephon in a Dublin back room, Manuel Marulanda Velez in a clearing in the high jungle of Tolima, Velupillai Prabhakaran in the tree line above a back road in Jaffna, Captain Ismail Khan in the armory of the 17th Division in Herat, Subcomandante Marcos at a microphone in San Cristobal at dawn, Yevgeny Prigozhin in a video message released to his Telegram channel at midnight in the south of Russia. I have spent 20 years walking through the rooms where wars actually start, and I will tell you something I have learned, and it is the only lesson I trust completely. The men who start wars are almost never the men who end them. McStephon did not see the Good Friday Agreement. Marulanda did not see the Havana Accords. Prabhakaran was killed on a beach. Captain Ismail Khan, alone among the 6, lived to be an old warlord, and is, as far as I know, still alive, somewhere in exile. Marcos retired into a different name. Prigozhin fell from 28,000 feet over Tver region. 6 first shots, 6 trajectories. The men who fire the first shot do not control the trajectory. That is the only thing the trajectory has in common with itself. Watch the dates. Don't watch the slogans. The slogans are written for the press release. The dates are written for the historian. December 28, 1969. May 27, 1964. July 23, 1983. March 15, 1979. January 1, 1994. June 23, 2023. August 23, 2023. Memorize the dates. The slogans you can throw away. The dates are the bones of history, and the bones are what survive when the flesh is gone. I stood in a Rostov cafe on June 23, 2023. I watched the column pass the window. The waitress kept refilling my coffee. Nobody spoke. I thought about the back room in Dublin in 1969. I thought about the clearing in the Colombian jungle in 1964. I thought about the road outside Jaffna in the dark in 1983. I thought about Captain Ismail Khan opening the armory at dawn. I thought about the masked man stepping to the microphone in San Cristobal. And I thought about the man whose column was passing the window, who had 60 days left to live and did not know it. They all said the same sentence. They said it in different rooms, in different decades, in different languages. They said it on the day they crossed the line they could not walk back. Today, we begin. That is the sentence. That is the only sentence that matters. Every war, every insurgency, every rebellion, every march on a capital, every column on a highway, every armory thrown open at dawn, every banner unfurled in a colonial plaza at midnight, every ambush in the tree line, every back room with newspaper taped over the windows. They are all the same sentence. Today, we begin. 6 rebellions, 6 first shots. One of them ended in a plane crash 60 days later. The next one, somewhere in the world, is being prepared right now in a room I have not yet walked into. There is a kettle in the corner. The windows are taped over. 16 men are sitting around a long wooden table. They do not yet know what they are about to start. None of them ever do. My name is Blackwell. I will be in that room when it happens. I always am.